So Tottenham Hotspur have lost again. I don't think that's really a shock at this point. Relegation feels inevitable, essentially, and it was just another performance which we've seen all season. If we're honest, it was a team which just looked bereft of any sort of ideas, any sort of any sort of character, and I'm just resigned to relegation. I felt a bit like that after Fulham. I did record a video, but the audio wasn't right, so I didn't put it out. But I'm just looking at this team and I'm thinking, where is the belief? The heart, the ideas. It just looks completely like a team of strangers, and I don't think that all of it's down to the players, but they need to take a lot of accountability, because this is the same group which, in spite of similar circumstances last year where we did have a lot of injuries, that we effectively just wrote off the league campaign last year, and it almost feels like we're doing it now. I know that's obviously not what a conscious effort, but the players, the same players who've down tools under Postecoglou, the same players have down tools under Frank, and it looks like the same's happening under Igor Tudor. And one thing that really annoys me about this Tottenham team is that you look at teams from the past, and teams where you've had the likes of I wouldn't even go as far as to say a Kane or a Son, but you might have someone like Eric Dyer who just gets the club, and I just don't see any of that from this team. And I'm looking at our leaders, Romero, who's what's his discipline record, sometimes is often overblown. He's cost us multiple times this season with unnecessary red cards. Van der Ven has completely sort of down tools by the looks of it. Ever since probably November, December, he's been poor this year. And just as Romero's coming back, Van der Ven's now got a suspension, so that's us going to Anfield, 1 point off of relegation at a ground where we never win, and it's another game where we're not going to have our first choice centre backs available, and especially at a time where all of our sort of attacking areas are really, really short in terms of numbers. Midfield don't look too bad, but across the squad there's so many injuries, so to be picking up these suspensions just is so unnecessary. And it's the sort of thing which when you're down on your luck and you've got all the results going against you, not even just in terms of the relegation battle, but in terms of Man City dropping points and Arsenal extending their lead at the top, this is a time for players to be stood up and counted. And it almost felt like even before the red card that defeat felt inevitable, and the players sort of had resigned themselves to that. And I think the only two which didn't really show that attitude was Matisse Tell and Archie Gray. I thought Archie Gray had, all things considered in terms of the circumstances of the game, what we can offer going forward, or certainly what we showed we can. Archie Gray was probably our best player today, and I think it was quite comfortable. Him and Matisse Tell, two players who are 19 and 20. Archie Gray, a player who's, come in and he's never actually played in the exact position we signed him for, and he's sort of played everywhere but that position. You've also got Matisse Tell, who's onto a third manager who, doesn't really see him as a starting player, but whenever he plays he seems to, not necessarily make an impact, but look to want to make an impact. And that is just sort of how low the barometer is, I suppose, at the minute. That players like Richarlison, who, yes, we know, in the past we've said he's not necessarily, the sort of, striker which you can hang your hat on, so he's going to get a certain amount of goals, but it brings an element of fight to the team, and that's something that we really, really need at the minute. And relegation just feels inevitable. I felt that way after Fulham, and tonight just confirmed it. Even before the red card, Palace had a ridiculous goal disallowed, and they could have been 2 or 3 up, and we got a goal against a run of play. And I don't think it is Tudor's fault in terms of the situation that we're in. 100% it's not his fault, but he's been dealt a pretty bad hand, but he's playing it poorly. Arsenal, bit of a free hit, so you're going into Fulham and you're expecting a bit more fight, especially with how much he's saying that he wants to play attacking football, and we've not seen any of it. Even today, the first 20 minutes before there's any real action, it was all Palace, and there's a graphic that come up on the screen saying that we'd had 10% possession or 15% or something like that at home. And the thing is from other Premier League clubs' points of view, Spurs going down would be huge, because there's talent in that squad that can be picked off and put into the right team and really take that club forward. And I was trying to think of the players which probably would stay if we went down, and even some of the players that don't necessarily get universal backing from the fans, like Solanke. They'd probably be off. Tell probably might be off as well, and it gets to a point where you think, who is going to be around, and it looks like a group of players who are playing for, it just seems like relegation doesn't bother them, that they know that if we do go down, you might get a pay cut, but you might get a better contract somewhere else in the Prem if you go down. And once again, it's the fans of the club who are left to bear the brunt of this, because when we go down, a lot of that squad will move on, and it's the same fans who have followed us home and away, who were in Amsterdam, who were in Mura when we lost to them in the Conference League, who were in Bilbao, who might have been at St James's Park when we lost 6-1. All of these things, they'll go home and away, and they deserve so much more. They're brilliant against Fulham, the fans, and we've not deserved the squad, the football, the leadership or lack of that's been shown over the last 2 years. And ultimately, the players will take some blame. Thomas Frank will take a lot of the blame, but all of this has to be pointed back at the door of ENIC, who, as far back as Harry Redknapp, wouldn't go that extra mile, would settle. And that's what we are. We're a club that seems to be run by people who are just happy to settle, and that's the culture we've had at Spurs. Going back as far as Redknapp, when other teams were spending big in the window, we knew that we'd need to spend a little bit more to catch up with them. And when we weren't, and we were just settling for what we have, and every year these clubs that we're meant to be competing with are going that extra mile, there comes a point where all of that catches up with you, and it is just an absolute group of charlatans behind the scenes. You've got Vinay Venkatesham, who seem to be this lauded CEO of Arsenal, but they seem to have improved a lot more since he's gone. Johan Langer, who moved on from Aston Villa, and they seem to get better. Thomas Frank, who moved on from Brentford, and they seem to get better. And it's what happens when you just gradually drain a club of quality and what it needs, and there becomes a point where standards drop maybe 5% year upon year, and then it only takes 2 horror seasons domestically like we've had in the last 2 seasons to really, really fast track that decline. And we're at a point where when we go down, we're going to need to come back up straight away, and if we don't, then that is going to set the club back even further. And the fact that, we got to February, 4 or 5 points above the relegation zone, and somehow the board didn't seem to realise that the fans weren't having Thomas Frank, that the players weren't having Thomas Frank, even though every, home and away game pretty much, give or take, they're being booed off the pitch. Frank was being booed himself personally, not only the players. And it comes a point where you can only ask so much of fans. Though you got to take the rough with the smooth, but also you've got to give something to the fans to bring them with you, to get you over that line. And it's always the fans who are being asked more of. Every time a ball goes out of play, you got Pedro Porro throwing his arms up like that, trying to get the crowd going, as if we've not watched utter shit at home domestically for 2 years, as if we're not above relegation by the skin of our teeth, losing, being drawn into relegation battle by a team like West Ham, who we kick-started that sort of bid against relegation. And all of it is so inevitable if you've got someone that is remotely, competent in charge. And the fact that the board have gone out in January and, that absolute car crash from a PR perspective of that interview from Johan Lange saying, we don't want to panic in the transfer window. We don't want to, go out and sign someone for the sake of it. But by that same logic, Conor Gallagher, yes, whilst he's plugged the gap with injuries, isn't what we need and feels like a bit of a panic buy. The fact that, going into the window, it was all about, Spurs really want to prioritise the left wing position, the same position that they sold Son last summer and didn't replace. So now we've gone into another window and not replaced them, even though that left wing's meant to be a priority. But we knew as of maybe, I don't know, Christmas Day, that Semenyo was going to Man City. So if all of your plans was to really, really attack that left wing position in the squad and fill that gap, okay, so Semenyo's not coming. Where are the alternatives? Not a single link, not to Ademola Lookman, Oscar Bob, anyone like that. And then on top of that, you're going in and you're selling Brennan Johnson, your top scorer from last year, and not replacing him. And then 2 days later, Mohamed Kudus gets injured, so we've got no one on that right wing, and you're not replacing him. It's poor. We've got an attack who just look toothless, a midfield who, was combative, at times on the day, not that we've seen it much this season, are, a team of workers, not necessarily high technical quality. We've got a defence who, whilst on paper look good, can't seem to function at the back, and we seem hell-bent on, forcing this, sort of ball-playing goalkeeper in Vicario, even though he literally can't kick for toffee. So I don't know how we're going to turn it around. I don't think we are going to. In terms of Tudor, I've not been impressed with what I've seen so far, but I'm aware that, he's coming into very difficult circumstances, and the next person that comes in isn't necessarily going to have a change in circumstances. There's still going to be the players out injured that are. But for all of the talk of, how he likes to attack, likes to be pragmatic, we've not seen anything different from Thomas Frank. If not, I think we've probably been a bit more passive, which, I didn't think was possible, but here we are. And you wonder how much that's down to, tactical decisions, and also the players. Are they up for the fight? I don't think they are. Against Fulham, I thought, Sousa looked a little bit up for it, Richarlison did, Tell did, Gray did, but that was it. And it just feels awful. Like, you think back of, teams before, some of the great Spurs teams that we've seen, and players like Dele Alli, Son, Kane, not even necessarily the greatest players, but someone like Lamella, Chadley, players who, whilst limited technically, would just give everything, and it feels like we're crying out for someone like that, and that is such a damning statement for us to be saying we're missing a Lamella sort of character in the squad. And this is March 2026. Eric Lamella's not even playing football anymore. It just feels like there's a real vacuum of leadership, of personality, of any sort of competent, decision making. It's just completely tone deaf. And as soon as the season tickets renewal dates was coming out, the club were pushing the narrative of, we're gonna, that wage structure there, we're gonna break down in summer, we're gonna break it, only if we stay up, but we are gonna break it. But we're not gonna stay up. So what's the plan now? What is the plan? When they're putting the season ticket prices out, did they consider that we might be in the Championship, or did they just see the pound signs and think, they'll renew loyalty, that they can't not renew because someone else will take their seat? That seems to be, the precedent, I suppose. Everything, just top to bottom, feels like some sort of cruel, twisted joke. I mean, I was probably too young. Well, I was too young when Arsenal won the league at our stadium with that Judas on the pitch celebrating for the second time to win the league, and you think that can't probably get worse. I was quite lucky that I avoided that in terms of just my age. But we're now living in a world where Tottenham are probably going down and Arsenal could win the league. And I'm 25, so I can't hide behind, adolescence or naivety and not sort of see this, scenario for what it is literally the stuff of nightmares. And the people who've making the decisions at Spurs have been getting wrong for so long. We've moved from White Hart Lane to this new stadium where yes, you are leaving behind history, heritage, home for so many people, to move into this bigger, new, shinier house. But you've moved into this house and the pipes are burst, there's water coming through the ceilings, and it feels like the people in charge, the landlords in this scenario, they're phone off in Dubai, wherever it is, somewhere nice with the sun, and they don't care because ultimately they're getting paid. And that feels sort of like ultimately like what's happened with this stadium move. And we grin and bear Wembley for 18 months more than we thought we were going to originally. We went through transfer windows not signing anyone when we were this close to getting over the line, and that was bad enough. And then under Conte, another crossroads. If the Champions League final wasn't won already, we've then gone through Mourinho, gone through Nuno, landed upon Conte, who was a brilliant manager in that first sort of half season. And then we just didn't kick on from there, and Arsenal have. And when that happened, I was in my last year of university. It's now less than 5 years since then, and Arsenal on course to win the league, maybe the Champions League, maybe even the quadruple technically still possible, and Spurs could go down. And I've got genuine Stockholm syndrome for Daniel Levy, and that is something I thought I'd never say. But at least we knew who was making the decisions then, because now is it Peter Charrington? Is it Vinay Venkatesham? Is it the Lewis family? Is it Langer? It is just complete neglect from top to bottom. Nobody taking responsibility, nobody taking any sort of accountability, nobody recognising the situation that we're in. It's just passing the buck from top to bottom. The players look like they're passing the ball to pass responsibility, and with the exception of the likes of Richarlison, Archie Gray, Matista, I don't think any of the team are up for it. And the worrying thing is that the teams around us are building momentum, and we've given them that shot in the arm, whether it was the loss to Forest, the loss to West Ham, the draw to Burnley. We are fucked. And that's the only way I can put it. And I wish I had a more positive spin to put on it, but from top to bottom, we are fucked. But, we'll keep going. The fans will still be there, cheering on, probably, being forced to pay stupid money again. But we'll be there. Championship, or Premier League, or even League One, maybe, if things decide to get even worse next year. But let's just hope for a miracle. And until then, up Spurs.